Hi there, I'm Dre. Welcome to this week's video. Today I would actually like to talk about some acronyms. So in the health IT space, we tend to use an enormous number of acronyms for anything and everything that we can think of. We like to shorten things into, brief little catchy phrase words or a couple of different letters so that they can be communicated in a quick and efficient way. The acronyms that I want to touch on today are maybe some of those that you don't come across very often, and they are tied to the procurement process. When we're rolling out new systems, if you are working for a public sector entity, you often have to follow procurement laws to actually acquire those goods and services. And with those procurement laws, there are proposals that are posted for the vendor community to respond to. In that world, there are quite a few different requests for acronyms, and I wanted to go through what those are today to give you an idea of when you would use each one and why there are so many of them. So before I get started, if you haven't had a chance to subscribe to the channel yet, don't forget to do that, and if you like the video as we're going through it, don't forget to hit the like button. So the first one that I want to talk about is RFI, or Request for Information. So an RFI is something that an organization would put out publicly to the vendor community to ask for information about a particular scope of work. They would putting it out to get information on how something would be done, what sort of functionalities and options are available in the general marketplace, and really trying to understand more about the capabilities within that particular scope. So there is usually a high-level description of the problem or situation that the organization is facing, as well as a few different questions for the vendor community to answer as to how they would solve those problems. A couple key things about an RFI. So an RFI is often part of a multi-stage procurement. It's often the first thing that is actually done, but it is certainly not the last. A contract cannot be generated off of an RFI. So from a formal contractual perspective, it is just an ask for, tell me what's out there. But you don't generate contracts off of an RFI. You need a subsequent procurement step to actually work through that. RFI responses that are received from the vendor population are reviewed by the organization, but they are not formally evaluated. So you often have a wider group of people that are looking at an RFI, and it's really to let you know what types of solutions are out there for a problem that you believe that you have or a problem that you're looking to solve. So the next one I want to talk about is RFEI, which is a request for expression of interest. This can also be called just a straight EOI, or expression of interest document. So it can be RFEI or EOI. See how there's acronyms everywhere here? Organizations use these to gauge interest from the vendor community. So they reach out to the vendor community and say, this is the problem I have, this is the solution I'm going to look to procure, or these are the services that I'm going to look to procure. Can you tell me if you would be interested in responding to something like this? Again, this is part of a multi-stage procurement process, and RFEI is not something that you're going to generate a contract or award a contract off of. It is just a mechanism for reaching out to the vendor community or to the supplier community to say, if I were to go to market for this, is anybody interested in supplying this to us? So RFIs may also include some parameters for procurements. And what I mean by that is, in some instances, people will go out for an EOI or an RFI and they will say, we're looking to procure X, Y, and Z, and this is the general budget amount we're looking for. Is there any interest in the vendor community in being able to supply that to us and to achieve that within these parameters, or are there concerns? Responses for this are also reviewed, similar to the RFI. They are not formally evaluated. Again, there's no contract can be generated off of this, and this also cannot be used to shortlist individuals. So if you do get multiple people that say, I am interested in doing this, you can't utilize their responses to shortlist to a smaller group. So next up, we have request for qualification, or request for supplier qualification. With this, you're going to go out to the general community. You're going to articulate what it is that you're looking for. describe a series of requirements and ask the vendor community to respond to those. You are going to formally evaluate a request for qualifications. There is going to be a team that's going to look through the responses and evaluate and grade them, if you will, against a defined standard, of course. It is also part of a multi-stage process, and the purpose of an RFQ or an RFSQ is to shortlist your respondents. So it's going to take that larger group that responds, and it's going to narrow it down to a defined number of individuals that you're going to prepare the rest of your documents for. So an RFQ or an RFSQ needs to be followed by something else in order for a contract to be awarded. A contract can't be awarded off of the RFQ or RFSQ itself. It has to be part of a multi-stage process if you want to result in an agreement. So where you would want to do something like this is if you have a very large number of vendors that you believe are going to respond to the ask, and you want to narrow it down to make your subsequent process more efficient. Your official request process, they can be very, very labor intensive and very time intensive. So an RFQ or an RFSQ would help you narrow that down to a defined number of vendors so that you can hopefully improve the speed of that process. It also pre-qualifies them. So it's going to take away the big things that you need to know and sort of level the playing field, and we're going to start from here and go forward. Now I'm going to look for the differentiators, and I'm going to find who the best fit is for our organization. Another one that we see fairly often is an RFQ, which is a request for quote. This also sometimes has the acronym of ITQ, or invitation for quote, or IFB, which is invitation for bid. So it depends which jurisdiction that you're working in, but you may see RFQ, IFB, or ITQ, depending. They all mean the exact same thing. So procurement law in different places usually articulates when you can have a request for quote versus when you need to go to a formal request for proposal. They are often based on dollar amount thresholds for the contract to be awarded. So in instances where your contract is, say, under $100,000, you may be able to go for a request for quote. Whereas if you're over $1 million, you're going to have to go to a request for proposal or some form of that process. And that will really be dictated based on the procurement rules of your organization and the procurement laws of your jurisdiction. With a request for quote, the organization is going to outline what the deliverables are, what is expected of the vendors, and the vendor community is going to come back and provide a quote for that statement of work. Typically, these go out to a defined group of individuals. They may go out to companies that have master service agreements with your organization, or they may go out to known vendor providers in the community or in the space, and you are going to formally evaluate the responses when they come back. The RFQ, that is a request for quote in this instance, is going to generate a contract at the end. With RFQ, it's very important that you understand if it is a request for quote or a request for qualification. So again, they're two different things. They utilize the same acronym, which just makes everything more confusing. A request for quote can generate a contract after it. A request for qualification is meant to shortlist and cannot result in a contract on its own. An RSO is a request for standing offer, and this is used for organizations to establish relationships with a supplier or a vendor where they can continually go to that provider and generate additional statements of work or add on to work over time. So they are asking someone to meet criteria and to qualify and have them be selected as the successful vendor, and then they are going to generate different work orders or statement of work after that for the length of term of the standing offer. Requests for standing offers are formally evaluated. They're used very frequently for small professional services work, as well as for supplier contracts that are present in the healthcare space with things that you're going to procure over and over as time goes on. The standing offer itself is not a binding contract. Where the contract comes into play is with each purchase order, each work order, each statement of work that's generated off that standing offer. But the standing offer sets up the framework for which you can go back to that individual vendor for things that are included in the RSO. So the scope of work that's included in the RSO, you can keep going back to that same person time and time again without having to put out an RFQ every single time. So RFT isn't something that we see Super often in the healthcare IT space, this is a request for tender. So it is an invitation to suppliers or the vendor community to respond with their ability to meet the needs of a specific tender. So you're going to outline as an organization exactly what it is that you're looking for, and they will respond formally saying whether or not they can meet those criteria. A request for tender is a little bit less complex than an RFP. It is formally evaluated and it does generate a formal contract. Typically for an RFT, the factors that you're going to be looking at are specific quantitative factors, so things like certificates, very clear standards that someone's going to agree to, and you're also going to be factoring in price quite heavily. I don't want to say that creativity is not there, but there's less subjectivity in an instance where you would use an RFT, so you're looking for something that is fairly cut and dry. So I believe they're used primarily for things that are very, very well defined and have very clear parameters around them. An RFP, or a request for proposal, is the one that we see most often in the healthcare IT space, and that is because we're usually procuring large systems, large information systems, or a significant amount of professional services such as project management work, development work, things like that, where we're going to cross thresholds and we can't use the request for quote process. So an RFP is a very structured document. It is going to result in a legally binding contract. It can be a standalone. You can go straight to RFP, or it can be something that follows one of those previous processes, so the RFI or the expression of interest. It can follow those, request for supplier qualification. The RFP is going to provide all of the context and information that is relevant to the product or services that you're looking to acquire. It's going to clearly articulate what your requirements are. The vendor is going to formally respond. The formal responses in writing are going to be evaluated. You can also have demonstration rounds. You can have physical reviews of products and RFPs, but they're going to be formally evaluated, and you are then going to enter into a contract process. There's three main types of RFPs that individuals use. So there are Baffle-based RFPs, and Baffle stands for Best and Final Offer, and that's where you would release an RFP, you would have your vendor community respond. If required, you would shortlist to a group of people, you'd go through your demo rounds and everything like that. You'd then get to your finite list or your short list of vendors. You're going to reissue the information and ask them to come back with their best and final offer, and you're going to take the final offer that stands based on the evaluation criteria you've set. The other one is a consecutive negotiation RFP, and that is where you're going to work your way through the process the exact same way. You're going to do your evaluations. Everything's going to happen there. You're going to get to your top selected proponent, and you're going to negotiate your contract with them. If something were to happen during the contract negotiations where that isn't going to result in a mutually agreeable endpoint, then you have the ability in a consecutive negotiation to go to your second place choice. Again, there's very, very strong rules around this. There are procurement laws that are in place, but consecutive negotiation has a contract negotiation with just one person, and then you would go to the second in the event that that was unsuccessful or unable to be completed. The last RFP process that is being utilized more and more now is a negotiated RFP. With a negotiated RFP, the process is very, very similar, but the big difference is you're going to go to market and you're going to describe what it is you need without knowing the specifics. So the actual scope of what you're procuring may not be clearly defined when you first go to market. You're going to go out and you're going to describe what it is that the organization needs to solve, what is the issue, and what is required from the vendor community. They're going to come back, they're going to tell you what you do, and then you're going to negotiate with multiple vendors. Usually they may or may not be shortlisted. You're going to negotiate what the exact scope of that is, and then you're going to go through a final round where you put out a final revised proposal to say, this is the exact scope. Now tell me exactly how you're going to meet it and what the price of that is going to be, based on all the discussions and based on the further understanding that we both have in those communications. So those ones are coming up more and more lately. They are typically used in very large, innovative type contracts, so things in the technology space where stuff is changing very rapidly and the vendor community knows more about the space, knows more about the functionality, knows more about the direction than the organization may. instances, for example, if you're trying to replace a legacy system that's been around for a really long time and you're not exactly sure what's out there and not exactly sure from a scope perspective how you would go about doing that, it's a collaborative way of going through a formal procurement process. So it's a lot of acronyms. I hope that they make a little bit more sense now. I'll probably do some more videos on procurement in the future, but for now, that's just a high level of what each of the R acronyms stand for and when you would use each in the healthcare IT space. So if you like the video, hit the like button and don't forget to subscribe. I will see you again next week.